towards you in this direction. Another one there, it'll come in this direction. Because that's, next time you're near water, you can see this for yourself. Get yourself somewhere near where you can get a reflection of a vertical object and move around. Look at the if you've got something like this where you've got posts in the water, look at the post immediately in front of you without turning your head to the right or left, and you'll find that that reflection is very vertical and comes straight to your feet. Without moving your body, turn your head and look at a post to the right, okay, and you'll see that that reflection comes from that angle towards your feet, and the same with the left. Mustn't confuse reflections with shadows, of course. So anyway, let's continue with the story here. I think I can go a bit heavier, and I think I can bring a little bit more color in. So I'm just picking up a little bit more raw sienna in some places. You know, I said this area here is probably the closest to us. So I bulk out these darks around here, something like this. Always being careful to go either side of the post that's on your side of the pontoon. Now, there does seem to be like a sort of cross member. If you look at that photo carefully, there seems to be a supporting slat. So you can give that inference very carefully. Some of those shapes. Like that and like that. Okay, I think we'll leave it there for now. What I am going to do before we take a break is I'm going to put something in the posts, the uprights above the pontoon now, but that's more a single color. I'll tell you why. I'll choose something like raw sienna dry brush. So I've cleaned this little brush. As I'm speaking, I'm cleaning this little brush and ridding it of most of its water. But I'll take a bit of raw sienna onto my pickle lid again. It's quite dry. My raw sienna may not look particularly pretty. It's slightly contaminated by what's been, you know, what's come from my paint supply in my well here, but that's okay. But it's a warmer single color dry brush mark for these posts because they're receiving more light than the shadowed underside of the other posts that we've just been doing. So we can always put more of this sort of detail in these posts, but I just want us to establish some changes in colors and texture. Right. And I think it might be a good idea, folks. I mean, you could do the same thing, you know, with the reflections if you want at this stage. But we might be better off for these nearer posts. You know, you could still do that if you want to. But I think we'd be better off leaving these reflections for when we go back to doing the water, as we will get back into doing the water. Got a little more interest in the background here with the big brush. I've just swapped back to the large mop brush. I mean, you could be using the big round brush if you prefer. You don't want to go much smaller than the big round brush. So if I just dunk that in water for a minute to set it up, and then take the water out again, and I'll go back to a similar mix that we started with. That's the phthalo green, raw sienna. Just show you, let's just move that away before I go knocking it over. Yeah, phthalo green from here, raw sienna from here. Probably too much water in there at the moment. But I'm making sure it's very important to see how I load this brush. I'm not stabbing down vertically, because if you do that, if you just stab down vertically to pick up your paint, you're just loading the last half a centimeter of the brush. You need to roll it round on its side, because that's where we're going to be painting from. We're going to be painting off the belly of the brush, not the point of the brush. So I'll take some of that off for a moment and see what I've got here. Okay, that's okay. So I'm now thinking about making some slightly more individual shapes, and I'll quickly dissolve these in a moment. I just want to get the basic shape, the basic color, a little bit more raw sienna in this mix now. Over here, it's a scumbling effect. You probably can't hear this, but this is a dry brush scumbling effect. And once I've got enough of it on here, I'm going to attack that paint to dissolve some of that sort of fizziness, if you like. Remember, that's a building back there. Right, let's put some water in this brush. And I'll also pick up a very small amount of alizarin crimson, very, very weak. And I'm going to use this now just to modify what I've been applying to the paper. It's all off the belly of the brush, always off the belly of the brush for this type of effect. And the nice thing is, because you applied this dry brush in the first place, you retain a lot of that shape. Going around my posts again here. Now remember that top of that pontoon, we must leave it, we must leave some light. So that would be my guideline there. If I'm going to go into this area at the back there with color, there's an area above that pontoon, along that pontoon, that is white paper. I'm just painting out just above it there. So back to what we're doing with the what is mostly white, mostly green, with increasing amounts of water and paint. I'm just creating this backdrop. It's a little bit, it's probably too high in terms of green. So we've got to warm it back now. We could use a neutral. We could use Payne's Grey or something like that, just to knock those greens back. But I usually prefer to rely on the opposite color, which is red, of course. It's a green, so pick up a bit of alizarin crimson again, maybe a little bit more raw sienna. And with this red, you'll see just how much it'll knock the green back. There's still some evidence of my scumbling. I really like to sort of create not a busy per se, not a busyness, but an open texture. That's the best way to describe it. I think sometimes when we do these tricky areas, we think, oh, it's lots of small trees. I best try and, create lots of individual shapes of trees. No, what you should try and aim for here is an open texture, as I say, a sort of variegated effect. Now, if I take whatever's in this brush out with tissue, I can add some light to passages. Those sort of airy areas, those vacuous areas in between in the woodland, just by lifting some of that stuff back out. And what I'm looking for, the net result I'm looking for, is something that's not too garish color-wise, not too busy pattern and texture-wise, and you know, probably the temperature needs to be on the cool side. Right. I think when we get back to our tree later, we'll further be able to define the edge of this big tree to its background. But for the moment, I think that's a good place to let things settle. I'm not happy about leaving the white before we take a break, though, on these buildings. Those buildings are not what this painting is about. So I'm just going to take a bit of a neutral color now. At the moment, there's nothing in this brush. I've just cleaned it. A neutral, the obvious neutral color would be to paint it the same as the background. But we can't really do that. It'll look odd. So I'm just going to go with this really weak red that we had on the go from the Alizarin crimson and a bit of green. And we'll push that roof back a little bit with that mix. Drag it down into the wall of this little hut. Maybe I just want to get it to a point where it's not as noticeable. I'll just go a little bit, pick up a little bit of the ultramarine blue here. Painting around my posts, remember. There's a bit of a coincidence that I don't like there. I have a post on my pontoon that sits perfectly at the edge of that little hut over there. So I'm going to do something about that. Those coincidences are never good. So I'm going to pick up a sort of background color that we used, the green, the blue, the raw sienna. And I'm going to suggest that there's a tree or a shrub much closer, cutting that out like that. Okay, and now I think, now that I've come up with that idea, I think that's given me the answer to other areas in between here. So phthalo green, ultramarine blue, one of the siennas, raw or burnt, doesn't really matter. All I'm doing is slightly warming up an otherwise overly cool color. Now, if I run this green as though it's the shadow side of the underside of that roof there, it'll tie things in better. I've got a figure that I'm just painting over the head of, but there, if I want to keep them, that is. Painting up tight to my post. Again, leaving a little slither of light at ground level back there. And then making good the top edge in places. But I think that's done its, you know, it's done its own thing there, which is quite good. I think we've got to continue this dark shape right the way across the horizontal. So it might get a bit more, it might require a little more blue in the mix down here because it's that bit further away from us again. Always being mindful of there being posts from the pontoon that you might have to cut around. Okay. As I say, I think this is probably a good place to take a break. Do the same with this roof line, using the color, borrow a bit from here. That. Whoops, it just chopped my figure's head off there, and then through there. Just scanning that, taking my, washing my brush here with half an eye on the painting. I think there's call for a post here. That's better. Breaks up and otherwise, something about that gap didn't sit right for me. That gap between that post, that post there and this nearer post here. Now that I've hinted upon another post back there, that seems better. I don't think if it's if it's in the wrong interval, if you like, for all the other posts, I don't think it matters. It could be a mooring post completely independent of the pontoon, so it's okay, There we are. Okay, so there's a couple of ways we can take this painting now. For some reason, I feel as though I want to put my few figures in. So just picking up a very weak mix of ultramarine blue. And other than the shoulders, the immediate shoulder area of these figures, I'm just going to put that weak color in. Perhaps we'll give this the couple that are sat at the table some slightly complementary colors. A bit artificial at the moment because that's all I've used is I mixed the two together. I don't know if you can see that. I'm just pulling the blue into the red and the red into the blue a bit. It'll make their garments and make them as shapes and figures look more natural. I'll wait for that little bit of paint to dry before I give them place a head on their shoulders. Our nearer figure here, we could have this nearer figure quite dark because it would work well then against the pale building behind. So a bit of ultramarine blue, a little bit of burnt sienna, probably ultramarine blue dominant, and I'll leave a little space, central space down the body here. We can perhaps infer an arm like this, and then the legs will just sort of, I'll pull down off the paint that's already in this overcoat type shape that this person's wearing. Something like that. Now it's a flat, it's too flat, that color, so let's bring a little bit of cadmium yellow. I was a bit naughty there. I used a little bit of cad red, which isn't on the list, but if when I should have said, well, just use cad red and alizarin crimson and you'll get a very similar color to cadmium red. Just to prove the point, that's what I'm doing here, picking up a bit of cadmium yellow and a bit of alizarin crimson, and we'll get that very similar color. So I'll just go into that dark body there with a bit of that red, and it takes the flatness out of that figure, the shape of that figure. I've got one or two more figures over here. I really I'm probably spending too much time thinking about these figures. They should just go in more like this. That's how I would normally paint my figures. Just a quick brush mark, heads somewhere at the top of the shoulder there. Okay. Right, I'm going to go to a rigger brush and we can put in some limbs now. Start looking at making more of this main tree up here. So there's my rigger brush. I did say that I'd need something on that roof. I'll be careful not to get too overdo the colors in this painting, so I'm looking for something a bit more neutral here. Ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, and even borrowing a little bit of the neighboring color that's already on the painting. So I'm retaining the light tonal value. I've only knocked it back a little bit, but at least now we should be able to see the difference between that and the wall of the building, of course. Okay, so let's go back to what I was saying about the tree. I want to get into the tree. I'm going to pick up ultramarine blue, burnt sienna with the rigger brush. And I'll just take some individual darker limbs like this out from the center of this main tree trunk. And all I'm doing, as I said, just repeat those colors: ultramarine blue, burnt sienna. I land the brush, and as soon as the point of this rigger brush makes contact with the paper, I stay there for a second, decide on my route. I'll go in that direction, go in that direction. I'll change the angle dramatically, go in that direction, and just do that. Learn to do that. If you can get to do that fairly quickly each time, it'll look far more natural for it. As you can see, if I stop thinking about it, I can create a far more convincing, network of lines and branches and what have you. It's fatal to stop and overthink these things. Some branches that might just come down the other side of the tree, back up. So the branch takes a downward angle from here and an upward angle from that point. Now that's an oak, typically of an oak tree, that their limbs, they're quite angular. It's not like a willow tree where there's, there may be lots of willow trees around you. You'd expect a lot of willow trees around watery areas, but this is a good old, British oak tree. So let's go in about here. And as I say, what I'm going to do now is we'll take a bit of phthalo green to this mix, and I've picked up the small brush and back on the little size, whatever it is, round brush, and we'll concentrate on some of these clumps of leaf towards the edge of the shape. And inside, this is where I will go inside with some of these shapes. A lot of paint here, sort of dry brush if you like. Scumbling off the belly of the brush like this. Always thinking about how much I'm doing of everything. Is that enough? Should I stop there? Do we need a hint of something over on this edge of the tree? Would you expect to find a cluster of these dark leaves down here hanging down? You suppose you would. There's no rule to this pattern. Though often what I like to do with my trees is to suggest there's one area maybe that that isn't quite as adorned as much with foliage as the rest of the tree. There's usually prevailing weather conditions. If you look at trees and study trees, there's often, one side, a quarter of that shape, where it won't be quite as heavily laden in foliage because it might be, sort of east facing or something like that, northeast facing. It's only really in some situations you will get trees almost perfectly formed, and those tend to reside in protected areas where there's a lot of woodland around that individual tree. But exposed trees, the more exposed a tree is, the more you'll see this rather irregular shape to the actual tree itself. Okay, we'll leave it like that for a moment, and I'm going to turn my attention to the water. And I think we'll do the water. There'll probably be a little call for some line work with white gouache and the rigger brush, maybe some knocking back of that little hut, a little bit of shadow work, not too much, and we'll be done. So I'm going to use the 1-inch flat for the water. You could, you know, it really is up to you folks. What I'm about to do could be done with a large round brush like this, but I'm fancying a more sort of geometric shape to my reflections and things. So I'm going to go with ultramarine blue, phthalo green. I'm making what is very similar to it. You know, this is a volume mix, a lot of paint, quite a bit of water, a lot of paint, and I want it to look a sort of organic color, that color you find in healthy waters, sort of sometimes an olivey green color. Sort of more or less following what it's reflecting. So let's take a shape horizontally for the moment, bring it down nice and broad flat strokes like this, with some thinner lines directly underneath the pontoon itself. That's why I like the flat brush for this. You get a blade like, you get such a fine line off the blade of the brush. Now then, let's put some warmth in this. I just picked up some burnt sienna on its own and added it to my main puddle, the sort of mother puddle, as it's sometimes referred to. And then across here. And we probably will need to put something beyond, you know, we can't just have this huge hit of light the other side of the pontoon. I don't think so anyway. We'll reassess that situation once we've done the other stuff. So it could be wrong. It may be good for that. So just say, let's just bring in vary these striations, these ripples, vary them in your painting. You know, if you go up close, further away you go from here, the thinner those lines get. Once this has had a chance to go into the paper, I think we'll probably might benefit for some vertical reflections again, but this paint is too wet at the moment for us to be able to do that. So while that paint is thinking about going into the paper, what I'm cleaning this 1-inch flat brush, really cleaning it quite. I'm squeezing everything out of it, and getting as much water out of that as possible, because what I want to do is just bring a couple of reflections from here to land the brush here where there's no paint, the dry area, and take it into your wet paint and take your ripples out in that fashion, like that. Each time you make one of these ripples, you take the paint that the brush has picked up back out of the brush with tissue. So where else we could run another one back there, perhaps something like that. Getting rid of that paint that I just lifted. Yeah. Okay. So I'm really waiting for this to dry a little. I think what I need is you need to assess your paintings now the same way as I am. I'm looking at the dark that's underneath my pontoon, and it doesn't register quite the same as the green that's in my water. Now, it's a good idea to mix this color, to have this color green that you've been using appear in some of those darks, because that's what happens. Colors reflect. That looks instantly much more in keeping with the rest of the painting now. I'm just running over some of those dark areas with the same green mix that I just used to create my water. Right, okay. So I don't really want to speed dry this to do what I want to do, because that would make it too dry for what I want to do. Just going to take off that little, drop the little bit of water there off my hand, I think. Just take it off. Yeah, I don't want to sort of speed dry it. I think it's more or less ready. So the sheen's gone off it. It doesn't look quite as wet as it did about 30 seconds ago. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm just going to take my flat brush. It's been cleaned. There's almost no water in this. And I'm just going to bring a little reflection down at the edges here in places. Not too much. Wouldn't do too much over here in the bright area. Maybe a little bit over at this edge, something like that. There I come into about there, something like that. Okay. Now then, some of our posts all look to there's not enough variation in them. They're all the same tonal value. So I'm going to decide to take the small brush here, take a neutral color, bit of burnt sienna, bit of the green mix that we've just been using, and I'm going to say, well, we'll have a little bit more darkness in that post there, little bit of darkness at that point there where the post crosses over the horizontal. Same maybe for this one. Perhaps we warm that color up that I'm hitting that post with a bit. That's looking better for that already. So just the here and there hits of some further detail. That's it's not detail really. It's just the subtle textures, the nuances we find in these old wooden posts. Quite fancy this post here to be quite dark. It is reaching focal point territory back there. It's in that general area, so we can afford, I think, to sort of go a little darker in around this area here, because it's in this territory. Now there is a post back there, it seems, and I won't make too much of these posts over here, so they're going out of they're sort of disappearing out of the scene a bit. Bring this person down a little bit closer to the ground. He's hovering there, or she's hovering. Now there's this dilemma for me. This area immediately under the pontoon looks artificial, looks wrong. There's nothing there to support the background. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to be a bit cheeky. This round brush, this little round brush has been cleaned. It's got some water in it. I'm going to scrub around a little bit, and I'm going to borrow a little bit of paint from underneath that pontoon. And because there's so much paint used on that pontoon back there, it's not going to be spoiled for me borrowing a little bit. So I'm just agitating the edge of that shape and creating a sort of area of bank of. I just picked up a little bit of color off my palette, because we would expect there to be more shadowy type areas back along that area, because it's close to the water. Sorry, it's close to the land. And we'll go a little bit warmer, perhaps a bit darker. So now then, when I move further to the left, I don't think that should be quite as dark, because that land back there is getting further away from us. Still some evidence of a flatness of the water just about here, I think, beyond the pontoon. Okay, now I don't like the white paper on this end of the pontoon, so I'm knocking it back a little bit, looking for areas of white that don't look right. So just a little bit of that weak burnt sienna in that roof of that little building. Nothing too clever. And now I'm going to pick up the rigger brush again and finish this painting. So I'll start by a little dark mix of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. Mixing it up over here. Something very close to a dry brush, but not quite. So I'm just looking now for anything that will help nail the interest, if you like. Now there aren't, as far as I can see, any wires or restraints, anything linking these posts. But I'm going to put in what I'm going to suggest that there is some sort of steel wire across this foreground between the posts. There's posts there for a reason. Yes, they're probably mooring posts first of all, but I'm sure that there's some sort of health and safety issues if we didn't put wires there. It's an interesting one. It probably has to be open, doesn't it, to allow access to your boat once you've moored up on there. But I'm going to suggest that these things are there and they can be taken down with little sort of coupling links to get to your boat when you're there. I want something vertical, as though there's a post back here, maybe seems to be a pub or a cafe or something in this area. People are sat down back there. Just put a little dark mark near their heads, the back of the head of the little figures that are sat down there. You can't, you can't sort of say what these things are exactly. They're the incidental small amounts of detail. What they're doing for the painting, of course, is bringing a finish to them, bringing a point of interest to certain parts. And I probably do actually, yeah, I think we're just going to give a hint of shadow. I nearly forgot. I think we should give a hint of shadow to this. Back to the 1H flat brush for a moment. And make up my shadow mostly of ultramarine blue. even though there are other colors in this well that I'm mixing in. Actually, I don't want that bit of strong burnt sienna there. So ultramarine blue, lots of it. Bit of alizarin crimson. I'll have to water this down. I think that's much too dark, much too strong for what I need. So I'll go over to my, I'll show you what I'm doing here. I'll go over to my lid of this palette and take the color that I just mixed, put it across this bigger area like this. With a bit more water, that's a sure way of weakening the strength of that mix. A little bit more of the alizarin crimson in it. Okay, so I don't want to lose the light and dark. I can increase the dark with a bit of shadow underneath this tree. Something like this. You know, you'd expect that to be the shadowy underneath that strong canopy of leaves. You'd expect maybe even just a nice little diagonal shadow line across the tree trunk, light coming from the top left. Little bit of shadow perhaps underneath that, further enhance the shadow underneath that roof back there, and a little bit of shadow on the back end of that building. You know, again, it's how long is a piece of string. The roof maybe may have a few random abstract shadows over them because of the tree in front of it. Shadow again across some of that pontoon in areas. Shadow doesn't have any rules. It doesn't stop at walls. It doesn't stop at edges. Shadow keeps is a constant. It can appear and land wherever you want it to land. And that's the thing you've got to remember with shadows. And I think that's what puts people off doing shadows a lot of the time is not knowing where to place them. What basically, other than they can't go through stone walls, they fall as they're cast. You know, they can turn up anywhere, and they are a godsend. They're something that we fear a lot, but the truth is they are the artist's godsend because they can make or break a painting. So some random shadow back underneath this area here. Now I think small amount of shadow up to the edge of this nearer tree in the background woodland. If you look at that photo, actually, you can almost see these purple shapes just dancing through that woodland. Very subtle, but they're there. Don't see the point in having a bright green corner up there, so I'm going to knock that back. Now I am going to finish it with the white gouache. Straight from the tube of the paint, I push that rigger brush into there, and we'll just add a bit of life. To that. Now if I can get that slightly more dry brush, this white. So load it with paint and then just take a little bit off. Now it's not quite as wet now, that paint, that white paint. There may be somebody's hand holding something, a bag down here, catching light off the shoulder of this chap here. Even some, whereas we used dark lines for the cables between the posts, some white lines with gouache here. Reflected whites maybe. Put the white on somewhere, pull it down with your finger. And I think we'll call that, we'll put the mount round it and see what that looks like. As you know, it was always going to be a complicated, busy painting, and we've reduced it. You know, certainly haven't done. There's a lot more detail in the little huts and things if you look, and we've lost a hut over here. We've lost some of the smaller tree trunks that were just over here somewhere in the photo. There's a sort of stone wall effect along this in front of a lawn with people sat there. So we have reduced it. It's still, but you're still with a busy, finished scene. So that brings us to the end of this final part of my watercolour painting of Lake Windermere in the north of England, UK. Do check out my shorter videos, which have recently been launched. And if you want to join the Zoom classes, the live Zoom classes when they go out, just pop over to my website where you'll get the full details. In the meantime, hope you enjoyed this and happy painting.